Welcome to Telling the Truth 2020 at the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany, State University of New York. I'm Mark Koplik, Assistant Director. A symposium on politics, tribalism, polarization, and the future of democracy, Telling the Truth 2020 brings you conversations with major thinkers and public figures from across the political spectrum. We're excited to be here with George Will, one of America's foremost conservative public intellectuals for nearly 50 years. For many of us, even those of us who disagree with his political ideas, he's the living embodiment of rational dialogue between right and left. His twice weekly Washington Post column, his back page column in Newsweek, his countless appearances on ABC's This Week and NBC's Meet the Press have all been an essential part of America's political conversation and civics education. His announcement in 2016 that he had quit the Republican Party over its abandonment of principles in the Trump era seemed to represent a significant moment in America's struggle to define its own political identity. His newest book is his magnum opus, The Conservative Sensibility. It's a celebration of the wisdom of America's founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It's also a reasoned defense of limited government, individual liberty, minority rights, and curbs on executive power. It's an unqualified rejection of tyranny. It's also a rejection of European conservative values that he finds to be alien to the American political tradition, including a glorification of throne and altar, blood and soil, nostalgia, irrationality, and tribalism. You can purchase The Conservative Sensibility from an independent bookseller here on this page. George Will, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm delighted to be with you.
In upstate New York, we straddle the political divide between right and left. Our student population necessarily reflects that political diversity. Even so, we like to think of ourselves as one big family. Is that important, that feeling that we need to transcend our differences and come together in common purpose?
I think it is important, and I think there are differences that are healthy and differences that are not healthy. Differences that are healthy include those of ideas, different interpretations of how the history unfolds and how to think about the world. The unhealthy differences are those that focus on tribes, to use the phrase you've already used. That is, to be tribal is to, first of all, subsume individuality into group identities. And it seems to me very much that the point of modernity and the defining feature of the modern world is to rescue individuality from being subsumed into tribes or into clusters such as the proletariat, or into anything that is a passive result of the unfolding of iron laws of history. It is, in other words, to rescue human agency from those who would deny it with historicism or some other group identity.
So I'd like to talk about tribalism. I'd also like to talk about human agency, but first tribalism. Students often are seeking belonging. They seek to belong to a group or a community, and that can be very rewarding. But as you say, group identification can lead to a terrible state of political affairs. So can you talk about how a young person might negotiate that difference?
I believe I quote in my book Robert Frost saying, join a nation and maybe join a university and not much else. That is, joining is fine. Again, we have various associations, neighborhoods, families, social clubs, synagogues, churches, etc. But it's one thing to join, it's another thing to derive one's identity from membership in particular groups. Again, I would urge young people to avoid the flight from individuality. It's very tempting to either to furnish one's mind by swallowing an orthodoxy whole, and therefore you don't have to think anymore for the rest of your life, or to acquire an identity. Young people are in the process of defining themselves through their actions and their beliefs and their affiliations. And it's very tempting to get that over with. To say, well, I am what I've decided to be. I've decided to be this or that sexual preference, this or that ethnicity, this or that race, this or that victim group forged by the abuses of history. Again, above all else, resist being plied and belabored by the many doctrines that subsume individuality into group identities.
So your work is very much an affirmation of free will. You affirm the ability of individuals to use their freedom to change destiny and affect the world instead of feeling helpless in the face of historical forces. How can that message be communicated more effectively in your view to young people?
I think it's important for them to understand that they are fortunate. You in upstate New York, by the way, I'm no stranger to upstate New York. My father was a college professor and taught several times at Cornell, where he got his PhD, and I spent a half a year in high school at Ithaca High School, so I'm familiar with upstate New York. I would say that it's a common truth, disputed by no one, that we all are situated. We are situated in a social setting. We are, to some extent, the product of acculturation. What I'm arguing in the conservative sensibility is human beings are much more than creatures who acquire culture. Human beings have a human nature that's basic to the American founding. And those of your students who are from the United States are, in my judgment, inestimably privileged to be Americans and to partake of the philosophy of the American founding, which had three primary tenets. One, there is such a thing as a constant human nature. That is, we're not just the absorbers of whatever culture we find ourselves situated in. Second, that we have inalienable rights. First come rights and then comes government. Government does not give us our rights. Government exists, as the Declaration of Independence says in one of its most important words, to secure our rights that pre-exist government. And third, to that end, government is inherently limited in its functions. And in order to keep it limited, you need a constitutional architecture that we got largely from James Madison and the others at the founders, the purpose of which is to make government strong enough to protect our rights, but not so strong that it can threaten our rights. And once your students imbibe the basic structure of thought from the American founding, they have an identity as free people, as citizens of a republic. And they are therefore well on their way to defining themselves with a robust individualism.
The book is in some ways an expansion of your PhD thesis on minority rights in American democracy. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, I went to Princeton to get my PhD, intending to teach, and briefly did before I swerved into politics and then journalism, or as my father thought, before I sank to journalism. My thesis title was Beyond the Reach of Majorities. It's a phrase from the second of the Supreme Court's flag salute cases. In 1943 in West Virginia v. Barnett, they overturned their decision of just a few years earlier in Minersville, Gobitis versus Pennsylvania. The issue was, could Jehovah's Witnesses children be compelled to salute the flag as part of a ritual in school? In Gobitis, the Supreme Court said yes. In West Virginia Barnett, they said no. And Justice Jackson, in his opinion in West Virginia v. Barnett, said the very purpose of a Bill of Rights is to place certain things beyond the reach of majorities, above the vicissitudes of politics. It's a great, robust defense of individual rights and of the judicial supervision of that courts must undertake in order to protect individual rights against majority tyranny.
I just wanted to mention that Justice Robert H. Jackson, who delivered that decision, was a graduate of our affiliate institution, Albany Law School.
Outstanding. And so your students will know what a great man he was. He was also the principal US officer at the 1946 Nuremberg trials of the Nazi war criminals.
So we're very proud that UAlbany is one of the most diverse Tier 1 research universities in the nation. 50% of our students are people of color. We're keenly aware that many of America's founders were slave owners. How can we ask young people to celebrate the brilliance of the political ideas of Madison and Jefferson in light of those terrible moral failings?
First of all, one tries to avoid what's called presentism. That is, judging the past by the present. There's a certain moral vanity in the assumption that people seem to enjoy having these days, that because they own slaves and we don't, therefore we are sort of inherently morally superior. The fact is that the ideas unleashed by these men, including slaveholder from Monticello, Jefferson, and the slaveholder from Montpelier, Madison, those ideas led to the emancipation of America's slaves through a bloody civil war and an Emancipation Proclamation. That is, the United States certainly didn't invent slavery, which is as old as human history. What the United States did do was invent organized anti-slavery politics. For the first time, this was an American creation. And it turned out that the American Constitution, far from being a buttress of slavery, was perfectly compatible, as Frederick Douglass came to see and to proclaim, perfectly possible being an anti-slavery document. It was within the architecture, institutional architecture of the Constitution, as construed in the bright light cast by Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, that slavery was held to be incompatible with American ideals and swept away in a tide of blood.
So many of us have a stereotype of American conservatism as a nostalgia for an imaginary golden age of the 1950s. Which of course wasn't a golden age at all for many Americans. Your conservatism is not that, right? And can you talk about that?
Yes, in the phrase American conservatism, the adjective American does a lot of work in modifying the noun conservatism. European conservatism became self-conscious and articulate through Edmund Burke, in particular in his reaction against the revolution in France. And Burke pioneered a kind of conservatism that was in defense of hierarchies and against egalitarianism, and anxious about the dynamics of change. By the time conservatism crossed the Atlantic, it had become something very different. American conservatism not only welcomes change, it cultivates. It cultivates the churning of a market society, of a society of the spontaneous order of individuals acting on their own behalf or contracting together and cooperatively in a spontaneous order. It's been said that the Bible reduced to one sentence, the story of the Bible reduced to one sentence is, God created men and women and promptly lost control of events. Well, conservatives say that's just great because we don't want events controlled, because the controller is going to be government, and government that tries to control events is inherently reactionary. It is inherently predisposed to the status quo. And what we want is the solvent of perpetual churning which makes for upward mobility.
So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit more about that paradox. Your American conservatism is about a willingness to embrace change, and yet we associate conservatism very much with a wish for, say, cultural stability, family stability. Is it paradoxical to be a conservative who embraces change?
Not at all. What a conservative wants to conserve in the American context is the American founding and the three propositions that I just adumbrated. It is not the case, however, that conservatism is for willy-nilly churning of every institution. It does seem to me the principal domestic problem in the United States today is, to take up one of the things you just referenced, is the weakening of family structure. We know from abundant social science that family structure, an intact family structure, the benefits of being raised in a two-parent family coincides remarkably with individual and with community flourishing. The fact that 40% of all American first births these days are to unmarried mothers, the fact that a majority of mothers under 30 are not living with the fathers of their children. These facts are things that people are reluctant to talk about, but these are facts that are absolutely germane to the problems of the intergenerational transmission of poverty and the existence of castes or class in a society like ours.
But would you affirm, in let's say the freedom of an individual to pursue their right to happiness in a way that defies traditional definitions of family?
Of course, but again, conservatives are big on facing facts, on understanding things that are intractable in reality, and not trying to remold society or human nature in ways that defy the limits of malleability. So I would say certainly there's a broad tolerance. The drama of modern politics, as opposed to the ancients going all the way back to Aristotle, the drama of modern politics is people disagree about the good in life, about the proper ends of life. Therefore, the challenge in modernity, the challenge in an open society, is to accommodate diverse aspirations and ends, to tolerate these broadly, and to set up an institutional structure that still maintains that people with these diverse ideas of the good life can still live congenially with one another. That is the challenge. As I say in my book, the taxonomy of American politics is by now set and hopelessly confused in some ways. The fact is, what I'm calling a conservative is in many ways the legacy of classic liberalism, of Hobbes, Locke, John Stuart Mill, etc. That is the idea that the fundamental challenge is to protect individual life while having a commodious community life.
Many readers may find your definition of American conservatism in the book to be more akin to libertarianism. And why didn't you choose to call this book The Libertarian Sensibility?
Well, first, for several reasons. First of all, I'm not libertarianism carries a lot of kind of iron logic that carries it into strange territory. I'm libertarian-ish. Who isn't? By libertarian-ish, I mean, I believe that before the government interferes with the freedom of the individual or the freedom of two or more individuals cooperating together, it ought to have a very good reason and it ought to say what it is. If that makes me a libertarian, that makes almost every commonsensical American libertarian-ish, which is fine. Because we are a nation, as Lincoln said at Gettysburg, conceived in liberty. We are about liberty. We are not about majority rule. We're not about democracy. Democracy is a process. Liberty is a condition. And we are about the condition, not the process. The process serves the condition. The process is important, but basically we are about liberty.
You've been on so many diverse political panels. Do you have any practical tips for students about how to go about engaging with folks who disagree with them?
Sure. First, understand that disagreement is natural, which is to say inevitable. Second, and this is something I would hope they would learn at your institution, disagreement is fun. There's nothing more fun than argument. If you don't like to argue, you pick the wrong country, because we're a country made up of people who argue about everything. And isn't that wonderful? But don't feel that your basic, again, identity or moral worth is somehow under attack and assailed or insulted when someone disagrees with you. That's life. If you find that too stressful, then go back home, go up to your bedroom, pull the cover over your head and stay there, because the world is full of people who don't agree with you. Now, if you find that exhilarating, as I do, then you're going to have a good life. If you find it threatening, woe to you.
Can you tell us about your own political development as a young person, how you discovered your own political identity?
Yeah, I grew up in central Illinois, steeped in Abraham Lincoln's spirit. I grew up in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. According to local lore, it was in the Champaign County Courthouse that Abraham Lincoln heard about, where he was a practicing lawyer traveling the circuit in Illinois, where he heard that Illinois Senator Stephen A. Douglas had passed through the Senate into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It said that we would solve the vexing question of what to do about the question of could slavery expand into the territories, such as Kansas and Nebraska that were not yet states and were still federal territory. Stephen A. Douglas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act solution was popular sovereignty. Vote it up, vote it down. It's a matter of moral indifference to me, said Stephen A. Douglas, because what's important is that democracy and majority rule prevail. Abraham Lincoln's ascent to greatness was propelled by his recoil against this, in which he said, no, we are not about democracy, we are about liberty, and the rest is the unfolding of his career and of history. I went to college at Trinity College in Hartford, and was a sort of normal walking around college kid liberal. I was for Jack Kennedy in the 1960 presidential election, but it's well to remember that Jack Kennedy on matters of foreign policy in the Cold War was, if anything, to the right of Nixon in that election, because he was worried about insufficient military spending by the United States. Then I went to Oxford for 2 years. And then at Oxford, I saw in Britain what I thought was the slow suffocation of the social energies of a great nation by excessive statism, the watery socialism of the Labour Party. And I also, I went there in 1962, and I saw the Berlin Wall before it was 2 years old, which was a stark lesson in the stakes of modern politics. I came back having read lots of Hayek and Milton Friedman and some others. I came back and cast my first presidential vote in 1964 for Barry Goldwater. And I was off and running as a conservative.
Can our political crisis in any way be attributed to a failure of civics education in your view? Most kids have had courses in high school and middle school on American history and government, but is that somehow not enough?
That's not enough, no. I mean, just first of all, the sheer facts of civics matter. It would be rather nice if people knew the three branches of government, and if they knew what the First Amendment does, and if they knew what the 14th Amendment does, and these other things. I don't think there's any question that insufficient time is spent teaching people the simple facts of American history, including our constitutional history. Second, it is unquestionably the case that the common academic culture, which today is adversarial toward the American founding and the American history, tends to teach a kind of normative, again, adversarial stance to the American premises, which I've devoted my life to defending. It's simply staggering the high ratio of certainty to information that a great many people, particularly young people on college campuses, have these days.
You've said that a lightly governed society needs other institutions, like, for example, religious institutions, to nurture morality, yet you've confessed to being an atheist yourself. Where can young people go, apart from religious institutions, to have their morality nurtured?
Philosophy, to begin with, to understand that it manifestly is possible to be a non-believer and be a moral person. It's perfectly possible to devise codes of ethics and defensible moral systems without reference to theism, without reference to the supernatural. So I would recommend everyone studying philosophy take an ethics course. Understand that there's an enormous long pedigree of thought to the systems we have: utilitarian, Aristotelian, Aquinas, John Stuart Mill. I mean, the great towering thinkers have worried about these things. I know I have a dim memory of having been young once, and I know that the young tend to think that they're the first people who ever worried about some of these things. They're in for a pleasant surprise.
Do you have any advice specifically for young Republicans on campus?
Yeah, don't be a young Republican at this point. Again, I'll go back to Robert Frost. Don't join too many things. Join the nation, join, as he said, a university, but not much in between. Don't be in a rush to join a political party. Look around, think. There's nothing wrong with being a free agent. Standing not on the sidelines, but in the midst of the battle, but with your own cause.
Finally, in this uncertain moment in American history, would you like to share any reasons for optimism?
Sure. First of all, no one ever got rich betting against the United States. This is still a country people are fighting to get into by the millions, for very good reason. People know that this is still very much a land of opportunity. Second, you've used the word crisis several times, and let me just push back against that a little bit. People say we had a constitutional crisis. No, we've had one constitutional crisis in this country, and it occurred in the spring of 1861. 7 states had seceded formally, or said they did. We Lincolnians say they never seceded, but that's another argument. 7 states had voted to secede before Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. That was a constitutional crisis. A constitutional crisis is one where the institutions of the government cannot cope. The institutions of the government have coped perfectly well with the 45th president. People have said, well, Mr. Trump has posed a constitutional crisis. No, he didn't. He's a bad president, in my judgment, a bad fellow. And the country took a look at him and voted him out. That's sort of the way it's supposed to work. And the institutions did not buckle at all.
The book is The Conservative Sensibility. It's available for purchase via a link to the Independent Book House here on this screen. Our guest has been George Will. Thank you so much for being here with us.
I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you.